Section 4 of Highways in Hiding by George O. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The days dragged slowly. I faced each morning hopefully at first, but as the days dragged on, I began to feel that each morning was opening another day of futility, to be barely born until it was time to flop down in weariness. I faced the night in loneliness and in anger at my own inability to do something productive. I pestered the police until they escorted me to the door and told me that if I came again, they'd take me to another kind of door and lose thereafter the key. I shrugged and left disconsolately, because by that time I had been able to esp, page by page, the entire file that dealt with the case of missing person Lewis Catherine, stamped inactive but not closed. I hated the words. But as the days dragged out, one after another, with no respite and no hope, my raw nervous system began to heal. It was probably a case of numbness. You maul your thumb with a hammer and it will hurt just so long before it stops. I was numb for a long time. I remember night after night lying awake and staring into the darkness at the wall I knew was beside me, and I hated my Esper, because I wanted to project my mind out across some unknown space to reach for Catherine's mind. If we'd both been telepaths, we could cross the universe to touch each other with that affectionate tenderness that mated telepaths always claim they have. Instead, I found myself more aware of a clouded veil perception of Marian Harrison as she took my arm and looked into my face on that day when I admitted that I found little worth living for. I knew what that meant. Nothing. It was a case of my subconscious mind pointing out that the available present was more desirable than the unavailable not present. At first, I resented my apparent inconstancy in forming an Esper projection of Marian Harrison when I was trying to project my blank telepathic inadequacy to Catherine. But as the weeks faded into the past, the shock and the frustration began to pale, and I found Marian's projective image less and less an unwanted intrusion, and more pleasant. I had 2 deeply depressed spells in those 6 weeks. At the end of the 4th week, I received a small carton containing some of my personal junk that had been in Catherine's apartment. A man can't date his girl for weeks without dropping a few things, like a cigarette lighter, a tie clip, one odd cufflink, some papers, a few letters, some books, and stuff both valuable and worthless that had turned up as gifts for one reason or another. It was a shock to get this box, and its arrival bounced me deep into a doldrum period of 3 or 4 days. Then, at the end of the 6th week, I received a card from Dr. Thorndyke. It contained a lithograph in stereo of some scene in Yellowstone other than Old Faithful blowing its stack. On the message side was a cryptic note. Steve, I just drove along that road in the right side of the picture. It reminded me of yours, so I'm writing because I want to know how you are making out. I'll be at the Med Center in a couple of weeks. You can write me there. Jim Thorndyke. I turned the postcard over and eyed it critically. Then I got it. Along the roadside was a tall ornamental standard of wrought iron, the same design as the road signs along that fatal highway of mine. I sat there with a magnifying glass on the road sign, its stereo image standing up alongside the road in full color and solidity. It took me back to that moment when Catherine had wriggled against my side, thrilling me with her warmth and eagerness. That put me down a few days, too. Another month passed. I'd come out of my shell quite a bit in the meantime. I now felt that I could walk in a bar, and have a drink without wondering whether all the other people in the place were pointing at me. I'd cut myself off from all my previous friends, and I'd made no new friends in the weeks gone by. But I was getting more and more lonely, and consequently more and more inclined to speak to people and want friends. The accident had paled from its original horror. The vital scene returned only infrequently. Catherine was assuming the position of a lost love, rather than a sweetheart expected to return soon. I remembered the warmth of her arms and the eagerness of her kiss in a nostalgic way, and my mind, especially when in a doze, would play me tricks. I would recall Catherine, but when she came into my arms, I'd be holding Marion, brown and tawny, with her electric blue eyes and her vibrant nature. But I did nothing about it. I knew that once I had asked Marion Harrison for a date, I would be emotionally involved. And then, when Catherine turned up, I would be torn between desires. I would wake up and call myself all sorts of a fool. I had seen Marion for a total of perhaps 15 minutes, in the company of her brother. But eventually dreaming loses its sting just as futile waiting and searching does. And I awoke one morning in a long and involved debate between my id and my conscience. I decided at that moment that I would take that highway out and pay a visit to the Harrison farm. I was salving my slightly rusty conscience by telling myself that it was because I had never paid my respects to Father Harrison. But not too deep inside, I knew that if Father were missing and daughter were present, I'd enjoy my visit to the farm with more relish. But my id took a licking because the doorbell rang about 9 o'clock that morning, and when I dug the doorstep, I came up with two gentlemen wearing gold badges in leather folders in their jacket pockets. I opened the door because I couldn't have played absent to a team consisting of one Esper and one telepath. They both knew I was home. "Mr. Cornell, we'll waste no time. We want to know how well you know Dr. James Thorndyke." I didn't blink at the bluntness of it. It is standard technique when an Esper telepath team go investigating. The telepath knew all about me, including the fact that I'd dug their wallets and identification cards, badges, and the serial numbers of the nasty little automatics they carried. The idea was to drive the important question hard and first, it being impossible to not think the several quick answers that pop through your mind. What I knew about Thorndyke was sketchy enough, but they got it all, because I didn't have any reason for covering up. I let them know that, too. Finally, "That's about all," I thought. "Now, why?" The telepath half of the team answered. "Normally we wouldn't answer you, Mr. Cornell, unless you said it aloud, but we don't mind letting you know which of us is the telepath this time. To answer, you are the last person to have received any message from Thorndyke." What? "That postcard, it was the last contact Thorndyke made with anyone. He has disappeared." "But—" "Thorndyke was due to arrive at the Medical Research Center in Marion, Indiana 3 weeks ago. We've been tracking him ever since he failed to turn up. We've been able to retrace his meanderings very well up to a certain point in Yellowstone. There the trail stops. He had a telephoned reservation to a small hotel. There he dropped out of sight. Now, Mr. Cornell, may I see that postcard?" "Certainly." I got it for them. The Esper took it over to the window and eyed it in the light. And as he did that, I went over to stand beside him, and together we Espered that postcard until I thought the edges would start to curl. But if there were any codes, concealed writings, or any other form of hidden meaning or message in or on that card, I didn't dig any. I gave up. I'm no trained investigator, but I knew that Thorndyke was fairly well acquainted with the depth of my perceptive sense, and he would not have concealed anything too deep for me. Then the Esper shook his head. He handed me the card. Not a trace. The telepath nodded. He looked at me and smiled, sort of thin and strained. We're naturally interested in you, Mr. Cornell. This seems to be the second disappearance. And you know nothing about either? I know, I said slowly. The puzzle began to go around and around in my head again, all the way back to that gleaming road and the crack-up. We'll probably be back, Mr. Cornell. You don't mind? Look, I told them rather firmly, if this puzzle can be unwound, I'll be one of the happiest men on the planet. If I can do anything to help, just say the word. They left after that, and so did I. I was still going to pay my visit to the Harrison farm. Another wild goose chase, but somewhere along this cockeyed row, there was an angle. Honest people who are healthy and fairly happy with good prospects ahead of them do not just drop out of sight without a trace. A couple of hours later, I was making a good pace along the highway again. It was getting familiar to me. I could not avoid letting my perceptive sense rest on the sign as I drove past. Not long enough to put me in danger, but long enough to discover, to my surprise, that someone had taken the trouble to repair the broken spoke. Someone must have been a perfectionist. The brake was so slight that it seemed like calling in a mechanic because the ashtray in the car is full. Then I noticed other changes that time had caused. The burned scar was fading in a growth of tall weeds. The limb of the tree that hung out over the scene, from which the block and tackle had hung, was beginning to lose its smoke-blackened appearance. The block was gone from the limb. Give us a year, I thought, and the only remaining scar will be the one on my mind, and even that will be fading. I turned into the drive, wound around the homestead road, and pulled up in front of the big rambling house. It looked bleak. The front lawn was a bit shaggy, and there were some wisps of paper on the front porch. The Venetian blinds were down and slatted shut behind closed windows. Since it was summer now, the closed windows and the tight door, neither of which had fly screens installed, quickly gave the fact away. The Harrisons were gone. Another disappearance. I turned quickly and drove to the nearest town and went to the post office. I'm looking for the Harrison family, I told the man behind the wicket. Why, they moved several weeks ago. Moved? I asked with a blank-sounding voice. The clerk nodded. Then he leaned forward and said in a confidential whisper, Heard a rumor that the girl got a touch of that spaceman's disease. Mekstrom's? I blurted. The clerk looked at me as if I'd shouted a dirty word. She was a fine girl, he said softly. It's a shame. I nodded, and he went into the back files. I tried to dig alone behind him, but the files were in a small dead area in the rear of the building. I swore under my breath, although I'd expected to find files in dead areas. Just as Rhine Institute was opened, the government combed the countryside for dead or cloudy areas for their secret and confidential files. There had been one mad claim-stalking rush with the government about 6 feet ahead of the rest of the general public, business, and the underworld. He came back with a sorrowful look. They left a concealed address, he said. I felt like flashing a 20 at him like a private eye did in the old tough books, but I knew it wouldn't work. Rhine also made it impossible for a public official to take a bribe. So, instead, I tried to look distressed. This is extremely important. I'd say it was a matter of life and death. I'm sorry, a concealed forwarding address is still concealed. If you must get in touch with them, you might drop them a letter to be forwarded. Then, if they care to answer, they'll reply to your home. Later, I told him. I'll probably be back to mail it direct from here. He waved at the writing desk. I nodded and left. I drove back to the ex-Harrison farm slowly, thinking it over, wondering. People did not just go around catching Mekstrom's disease, from what little I knew of it. And somehow the idea of Marion Harrison withering away or becoming a basket case, or maybe taking the painless way out, was a thought that my mind kept avoiding except for occasional flashes of horror. I drove in toward the farmhouse again and parked in front of the veranda. I was not sure of why I was there, except that I wanted to wander through it to see what I could find before I went back to the post office to write that card or letter. The back of the house was locked with an old-fashioned slide bolt that was turned with what they used to call an E-key. I shrugged, oiled my conscience, and found a bit of bent wire. Probing a lock like that would have been easy for a total blank. With Esper, I lifted the simple keepers and slid back the bolt almost as swiftly as if I had used a proper key. This was no case of disappearance. In every one of the 14 rooms were the unmistakable signs of a deliberate removal. Discarded stuff was mixed with the odds and ends of packing case materials, a scattered collection of temporary nails, a half-finished but never used box filled with old clothing. I pawed through this, but found nothing, even though I separated it from the rest to help my Esper dig it without interference. I roamed the house slowly, letting my perception wander from point to point. I tried to time dig the place, but that was futile. I didn't have enough perception. I caught only one response. It was in one of the upper bedrooms. But then, as I stopped in the room where Marion had slept, I began again to doubt my senses. It could have been Esper, but it was more likely that I'd caught the dying traces of perfume. Then I suddenly realized that the entire premises were clear to me. An Esper map of the world looked sort of like a mottled sky with bright places and cloudy patches strewn in disorder across it. A mottled sky, except that the psi pattern usually does not change. But this house had been in a murky area, if not dead. Now it was clear. I left the house and went to the big combination barn and garage. It was as unsatisfying as the house had been. Philip Harrison, or someone, had had a workshop out there. I found the bench and a small table where bolt holes, oil marks, and other traces said that there had been one of those big combination woodworking machines there, the kind that combines circular saw, drill, lathe, planer, router, dado, and does everything. There had been some metalworking stuff there too, but nothing as elaborate as the woodshop. Mostly things like hacksaws and an electric drill, and a circular scar where a blowtorch had been sitting. I don't know why I kept on standing there esping the abandoned setup. Maybe it was because my Esper dug the fact that there was something there that I should know about, but which was so minute or remote that the impression did not come through. I stood there puzzled at my own reluctance to leave until something satisfied that almost imperceptible impression. Idly, I leaned down and picked up a bit of metal from the floor and fumbled it in my hand nervously. I looked around the place with my eyes and saw nothing. I gave the whole garage a thorough scanning with my Esper and got 0 for my trouble. Finally, I snarled at myself for being an imbecile and left. Everyone has done what I did, time and time again. I do not recall anything of my walk back to the car, lost in a whirl of thoughts, ideas, plans, and questions. I would probably have driven all the way back to my apartment with my mind in that whirligig, driving by habit and training, but I was shaken out of it because I could not start my car by poking that bit of metal in the lock. It did not fit. I laughed, a bit ashamed of my preoccupation, and flung the bit of metal into the grass, poked my key in the lock, and then I was out pawing the grass for that piece of metal. For the small piece of metal I had found on the floor of the abandoned workshop was the spoke of that road sign that had been missing when Catherine and I had cracked up. I drove out along the highway and stopped near one of the standards. I esped the sign, compared my impression against my eyesight. I made sure. That bit of metal, a half-inch long and a bit under a quarter-inch in diameter, with both ends faintly broken ragged, was identical in size and shape to the unbroken spokes in the sign. Then I noticed something else. The trefoil ornament in the middle did not look the same as I recalled them. I took Thorndyke's card out of my pocket and looked at the stereo. I compared the picture against the real thing before me, and I knew that I was right. The trefoil gizmo was a takeoff on the fleur-de-lis or the Boy Scout tenderfoot badge, or the design they used to signify north on a compass. But the lower flare of the leaves was wider than any of the more familiar emblems, almost as wide as the top. It took a comparison to tell the difference between one of them right side up and another one upside down. One assumes for this design that the larger foils are supposed to be up. If that were so, then the ones along the road out there or near Yellowstone were right side up, while the ones along my familiar highway were upside down. I goaded myself. Memory. Have these things been turned, or were they always upside down? The last thing I did as I turned off the highway was to stop and let my Esper dig that design once more. I covered the design itself, let my perception roam along the spokes, and then around the circlet that supported the spokes that held the trefoil emblem. Oh, it was not obvious. It was designed in, so to speak. If I were asked even today for my professional opinion, I would have to admit that the way the circlet snapped into the rest of the ornamental scroll work was a matter of good assembly design and not a design deliberately created so that the emblem could be turned upside down. In fact, if it had not been for that tiny broken spoke I found on the floor of the Harrison garage, never in a million years would I have considered these road signs significant. At the post office, I wrote a letter to Philip Harrison. Dear Phil, I was by your old place today and was sorry to find that you had moved. I'd like to get in touch with you again. If I may ask, please send me your forwarding address. I'll keep it concealed if you like, or I'll reply through the post office concealed forward. As an item of interest, did you know that your house had lost its deadness? A medium-equipped Esper can dig it with ease. Have you ever heard of the psi pattern changing before? Ah, and another item. That road sign with the busted spoke has been replaced. You must be a bum shot not to hit that curlicue in the middle. I found the spoke you hit on the floor of your garage. If you'd like it for a souvenir of one close miss. Please write and let me know how things are going. Rumor has it that Marion contracted Mekstroms, and if you will pardon my mentioning a delicate subject, I am doing so because I really want to help if I am able. After all, no matter how lightly you hold it, I still owe you my life. This is a debt I do not intend to forget. Sincerely, Steve Cornell. End of Chapter 4.